Great. So Lauren, if we can go to the next slide. So welcome again. Thank you so much for coming to this whimsical and lighthearted topic. We'll try to make it as fun and interesting as possible, but we really appreciate you guys being here. In a minute, we're going to let you introduce yourselves in breakout rooms for a couple quick minutes. But we're going to talk about a lot of requirements today, right? We're going to talk about federal and local requirements. We'll get a chance to talk about equity and equal access, some more policies. We're going to talk about data, SPMs, HMIS, different requirements, some more administrative requirements. We'll talk about final suggestions, tips and tricks, and answer some questions and provide additional resources. Though all along the way, we will be presenting tons of resources and hopefully things that you will be able to check back on that will help you out in the future. So a few things, we would love to hear your questions. It really helps us know what people want to know. There are no dumb questions. This is not intuitive. It's like everyone who's heard me ever present on anything related to HUD, you're not supposed to know this. No one can know this. And so much we don't know. We look stuff up all the time. We ask lots of questions, and this is what we do. So please don't feel like there's anything silly to ask. So we would love that. That being said, we know we have a lot of material. So we're going to sort of start asking questions, and we'll see how we do. But we want to get questions answered. So please ask them. And yeah, I think housekeeping. Again, we've recorded this. Lauren's putting the slides in the chat box, so you can have them there. You also can find them on the website. We will also put the recording on the website. You guys are all muted, but you can unmute yourself to ask a question. You can put a question into the chat box. We're going to be done by 4, but Lauren just told me she's okay staying after for a few minutes if people have burning questions or we end up pushing it because we have a lot of material today. So thank you for being here, and we're going to move on to introductions.
So Lauren's having technical difficulty getting the slides in the chat box, so I apologize for that, Liz. So when you're done presenting, if you could get them in the chat box, because I cannot figure out how to do it.
We'll do.
Sorry about that.
As we're doing introductions, I'll introduce myself. I'm Liz Isaacs from Housing Innovations, and I'm here with Lauren Peretti from Housing Innovations also. And
hi
now
guys.
Get a chance to go into breakout rooms and say hello, have a little human contact with others. And Lauren, if you do the next slide, we're going to ask folks to answer a couple questions. So if you can share your name, your agency, your title, how long you've been with the agency. And then Lauren has such great pictures we can all dream of, right? What are we looking forward to doing this spring and summer? So we are going to get into breakout rooms, and we're going to keep everything moving, so maybe 4 or 5 minutes. And Lauren's going to get you in, and you're going to just accept the breakout room, hopefully.
Everybody should be seeing an invitation to join a breakout room. So just accept that invitation and then you'll pop into a breakout room. So sorry about the Elizabeth slides. It won't let me access my normal drive to get them in there. Are you able to do it?
Yes.
We have to wait until they get back from the breakout rooms, otherwise they won't see them.
That's right.
think I just figured it out.
Because it's gotten harder, when it's possible, I just use links. So I just pull like the link off the website.
Yeah, it wouldn't let me
Because it's been such
copy
a
and paste
pain,
it
the
into the
multiple
chat
steps.
either. I couldn't copy and paste it. I copied it and then it wouldn't paste it in the chat. I tried that.
Excellent.
Being foiled at every turn.
Yes.
Anyway, I got it. I got the, I have it queued up here so that when they get back in, I should be able to get it in there, just the deck. So I'm gonna give them like maybe 1 more minute.
Yeah, so
And
it's
then-
2:09.
then-
I'm here, guys.
And then I'll close the breakout rooms. And I
I
think
don't believe that they've completed the intake. This is Megan. I don't.
Can you mute where that is? Or maybe I'll mute all that.
Yeah.
All right, I'm gonna close the, they'll get a minute warning when I close them, right?
Yep.
All right, the breakout rooms are closed now, so.
Great, welcome back. I hope folks got to look towards spring and summer if you haven't been. And if you have been, I hope you have great plans. All right, so we are going to forge ahead and talk about federal requirements. Right. So, yep, we're going to do federal and then we'll talk about local requirements. So next slide.
The slides are frozen.
Oh,
There we go.
It's all right. It's moving. So I won't go into great detail about our favorite federal requirements, but these are just helpful for you to have so that lots of times you're going to have to look for something. You might come to us and we'll help you look for it. But these are sort of the most important federal requirements. They're not always easy to find. They're in lots of places. That's what's hard. We're always wishing there were like one link, one portal where we could find everything. And I think Lauren's going to go back to the federal one. Are you clicking? You're sticking.
Yeah, sorry guys.
Well, that's okay. I'm gonna talk about it. They don't have to see it. So we talked about the CoC program interim rule. That is kind of like the regulatory implementation of the CoC program, right? And it was just updated in 2017. I don't know if they'll update it again. But it talks about the implementation of the CoC program, including the planning process I'm not going to read the HALD uniform and administrative requirements, but what that's supposed to do is reduce the burden on award recipients. And at the same time, make sure that we're using money the way we should be and not wasting and misusing funds. CoC program notices. This is kind of all the stuff that comes out with the CoC competition. So you hear us talking about registration, which we've actually already done for this year, the grant inventory worksheet or the GIW, and then it ends when there's the release of the NOFA or the NOFO. So for years it was NOFA, Notice of Funding Availability. They changed it to Notice of Funding Opportunity. Maybe they'll change it back, we don't know. But we all know what it means. It means all the information is put out so that we can begin well, we've begun the application process, but for real, begin the application process, understand all the things that can be funded, put together our applications. The CoC puts an application in. As providers, most of you probably know that you also do an application. It's a long, big process that we usually kick off in the spring or summer. HUD provides CoC frequently asked questions. These can be helpful because it's that cliche, if you have a question about the application, someone else probably does too. So we monitor these, we look at these, and then these actually become a record for HUD in a strange way. But then these actually can become, these are the requirements too. So it has multiple uses. And then for the YHDP projects, HUD has resources which are helpful in project implementation and compliance, all sorts of things. So if you're YHDP, that's a good resource to see. We're going to talk about local requirements. So layering on top of federal requirements, because that's not enough. We're also going to tell you that you guys have some local requirements too. So we have a boss can policy, excuse me, bar boss policies. I think Lauren went offline for a second with that, but that's fine. I'm going to talk about them. So the boss policies govern the CoC's work. It supports projects by making sure you know what compliance you need to be following. We have a Bill of Rights. There's a grievance policy. Lots of things worth looking at. And it's always a work in progress, right? So we take the policies to the steering committee, have discussions, vote, and that's where changes are made. And these are posted on the BOSS website. CAN policies help guide the work, the nuts and bolts of how the cans work, how folks are housed in that process. There's the new DOH, Rapid Rehousing Operations Guide. So that's again, nuts and bolts of what to do, how to serve folks in rapid rehousing. DEMIS has their rental assistance operations guide, and that's what's going to guide you if you have a DEMIS project. And then we also have CT-BOSS YHDP requirements, again, specific requirements for those projects. Okay.
Hopefully this will work better. I'm trying a different, Zoom wasn't cooperating.
Oh, that's fine.
This isn't quite as full of a view, but it should make the slide transition smoother.
Yeah. Oh, looks good. Forms. We've got a lot going on. Again, though, we're doing like a commercial for the CT-BOSS website, right? Check it out. A lot of good forms, things that hopefully are helpful. So if you're going to do an environmental review, if you have questions about eligibility, check out the website. And I'll do a little plug here because we're always looking to improve the website. So if you go on the website and you're frustrated because you can't find something, shoot me a note. If you have suggestions, if you're a really great visual person and you'd like to say you think we could present something better, we're always looking for suggestions because we want this to be a place that has resources that's helpful for you. And it's not helpful if it's not useful or frustrating. So please, we mean it. We actually would love feedback on the website, but check it out, find all the forums, documents, and all the good stuff going on. All right, so we are going to talk about the monitoring guide. I was going to tease Lauren. She put the dog in. No surprises. That poor dog looks surprised. But I like the dog. So it's a happy picture, right? So the monitoring guide, the intent is to pull together all the most important HUD regulations and rules that we think are most important so that providers can learn them, understand them, and then hopefully follow them. There are lots and lots of tools and links and stuff going on in the monitoring guide. They really are like purposeful, and we chose what we hope is most useful. So we really encourage you to click around to see what's there, because there's good stuff, hopefully, that'll be helpful. Anything else on monitoring, Lauren? I'm zooming. I know that's your baby. Did I miss anything talking about anything good? No. Okay. All right, next slide then. So everyone's favorite, participant chart documentation. So you'll be happy to know, I'm not going to really talk about this today. Just want to make sure you know it exists. It's a tool. It shows you what documents you need for each of the different housing types. Again, there are links to other forms and other guidance. Hopefully it's helpful. What we're hoping, our goal, is that this is something that you don't just look at in a sweaty panic 4 weeks before either HUD comes out, which is always more important than us, but before we come out or before HUD comes out. This is really meant to be a useful tool that you would bring to meetings or share with others and make sure that everybody's kind of on board with this. Because it's really hard if you start focusing on this again, like 4 weeks or 4 days or 4 hours before someone comes out to ask you a lot of questions, because it's a lot. We know, like, we should have started with all of this. It's all a lot. It's a lot of documents. It's a lot of thinking. It's a lot of preparation. So when it's possible to not do it last minute, that's our advice on the participant chart documentation.
It's also, I'll just say, maybe a tool for doing internal chart review, right? So we hope that programs are able, supervisors and programs, as part of their regular responsibilities, are doing some level of internal chart review. So you know what's in your charts and what's not in your chart. And this can be a good tool for enabling that.
Yeah, great. So just so we're on the same page, make sure everybody knows what a recipient and a subrecipient is. Some of you are both. You might be a subrecipient and a recipient. So the recipient, these are the folks that get the money from HUD, right? They enter into the grant agreement with HUD, and it can be a state agency, a public housing authority, or a not-for-profit. And then a subrecipient, we only have not-for-profits in Connecticut as subrecipients. It's the agency that gets money, excuse me, on the project through a subaward. So they get their money through the grantee or through the recipient. All right, we're going to talk a little bit about equity and equal access. So HUD and the CoC have a requirement that there is participation by people with lived experience of homelessness in your agency. And the first requirement for both grantees and subgrantees is that you have at least one person with lived experience of homelessness, either current or former, on your board. So it's either your board, or you might have another name, but it is your decision-making body. So it is not a separate entity. It is not an advisory committee. It is having a board member or someone who in your decision-making body that is a person with lived experience of homelessness. And then also, which is very important too, making sure that people with lived experience are involved in the program and how supportive services are actually provided in your agency, in your program.
So I'll just say that HUD requires that you have one person with lived experience of homelessness on your board. It's really probably better for that person not to be an isolated lone voice. And so we always encourage people when thinking about how to include people with lived experience in various ways, right? Have more than one person on your board. The one is a lonely number for someone.
How does that work with state operated agencies?
You know, I believe that Demas does have some, I don't know exactly the answer to that. I think that's Eric that's talking. But I believe that Demas does meet this requirement, and I'm not sure exactly through what mechanism, because Demas they're not going to have a board in the same way that a nonprofit will. But when we come out and monitor, we're really looking at the nonprofit agencies for this.
Okay. Oh. So with very good reason, there's been a much greater focus on both race equity and inclusion of people with lived experience of homelessness to be involved in all levels of the CoC, from governance to the day-to-day operation of programs. And so the slides next couple slides that we're talking about all provide opportunities that are in the guide on how agencies can do this, right? And some examples. So some examples in ways to promote both racial equity and consumer involvement include involving people with lived experience and those identifying as Black and Indigenous people of color and LGBTQIA+ in staff and in board positions. Also to take a look at who you're serving in your agency. So what are the demographics? What are the racial demographics? What's the ethnicity? What language are people speaking? And then what cultures are represented and how did the demographic makeup of your staff, including your board, compare? And if they don't, then what can you do to make things look more equitable? We want to create inclusive organizational cultures for both staff and for consumers. So do those identifying as BIPOC, people with lived experience of homelessness, LGBTQIA+, feel welcome and included? For staff, do these groups have equal opportunity for advancement in the agency? In terms of engagement, are there consumer work groups? Are there consumer surveys? Then if you collect these data, how are they presented? How do folks and how do consumers know that they have a voice in your agency? Other additional opportunities to increase consumer engagement and race equity is to think about what organizations are you partnering with? For example, do BIPOC have less, and also do BIPOC folks have less access to permanent housing than others? If so, how does this get addressed? Taking a look at the breakdown. Then what are the solutions? Is it staff training? Is it reaching out to landlords? So you're going to want to look at results and see how is our organization, you want to ask, better center the needs of BIPOC, people with lived experience in homelessness, LGBTQIA+ folks, so that outcomes are more equitable. Okay. So what we're going to do is we're going to ask agencies that have not addressed at least 3 of what the actions that we talked about in the last year to write an action plan on how you're going to make that happen. And this would happen if we were doing it during monitoring. And then we'd ask you when you can make this happen. And I should say, Lauren, I realized I didn't say this, that these are, we're calling these best practices in this round of monitoring, as opposed to a scored or right part of it. Okay, also what's new in 2022 is the LGBTQIA+ policy. So the goal here in the policy is to make sure that everyone has a safe and discrimination-free place to live or to get their services. So we want to do some things to make that happen. We want to make sure that in describing folks' identity, they get to choose their titles, names, language to describe it. Unless participants give permission, there's no disclosure of information about LGBTQIA+ identity. If there's ever harassment, if there's ever violence, that needs to be documented right away. And then we want to make sure that when working with participants and finding healthcare providers, that we're helping them find gender affirming folks to work with. We want to do some other things. We want to make single sex access bathrooms available. We want to make sure that folks who identify that all genders are welcome to all programs and all activities and all facilities, and that we want to make sure that dress codes also apply equally to everyone.
So I just want to say on the bathroom issue, I think you misspoke, Liz. So it's not single sex bathrooms, it's single access bathrooms, the opposite of single sex bathrooms, right?
That's helpful. Mm-hmm.
So it's making sure that if you've got a bathroom, right, that is only meant to be used by one person at a time, that bathroom is available to anyone regardless of how they identify gender-wise.
That's good. I'm taking us back 10, 20 years. Nice. Apologies on the stepping on. Yeah. I'm looking at the time because I'm almost at my time. So we want to create safe spaces and practices. And when we talk about safe space, it's obviously physical space, but it's more than that. It's social, it's cultural, it's the environment that's created by what you see, by how you're treated, by what you hear. And so in creating safe spaces, we want to talk to all residents about what transgender means, what it feels like to be disrespected, drawing parallels to other people's experiences, and treating all residents with respect. We want to train staff and volunteers. We want to model respectful behavior. We want to post signage about non-discrimination policies, and we want to provide affirming resource pamphlets, and then create connections in the broader community to provide support. And then we are going to establish the policy and publicly display LGBTQIA+ anti-discrimination policies. And then I would encourage you, Abby Miller from our team did the equal access training in the fall, which is fantastic. So if you have a moment to listen to that, there's a video recording and then there are slides on that with really, really good information. It's a great training.
So when we come in and monitor, we'll make sure we'll ask you for your LGBT, for your anti-discrimination policies, and we'll make sure that you've included, sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression in your policies. And then we'll just ask you a series of questions about your practices, the extent to which your practices are aligned with this new policy.
Great. So am I going to launch this, Lauren?
I can do it.
Okay.
I think. We'll see whether or not I can do it.
So we're going to do a quick poll.
Did I do it?
Oh, you know what? I can't see it.
Can everyone else see it?
Yes. They can, I can't. It's that they don't let the host see it. I don't know why.
So if everybody wants to just jump in there and answer. The first question is, does your agency have at least one person with lived experience of homelessness on your board? The second question is, does your agency engage people with lived experience of homelessness in meaningful opportunities to shape your services and programs? The third question, do your staff use participants' chosen titles, names, and language to describe their identities? And then lastly, if you've got single access restrooms, do you make them available to people of all genders? And it just asks you, each of them, you're just rating whether you fully implemented, started implementation, or not yet begun implementation on each of those things. So we'll give people another couple minutes here. Getting your answers in. Okay. 10 more seconds. So you guys should be able to see the results now. So it looks like good news. Most agencies have fully implemented each of the 4 practices, and where folks have not fully implemented, the most agencies that have not fully implemented have at least begun implementation of the practice, and there are only a couple places where people are responding that they have not yet begun implementation of the practice. So these are all things that are required. The first one is actually required by HUD, and the rest of them are all things that are required by CT BOSS. So if there are things here that you've not yet started to implement, please do that. We have started monitoring on the new LGBTQIA policy in 2022, and we'll continue that in 2023. And if you're having any roadblocks to implementing these things, let us know, and we're happy to help problem solve with you. So I'm going to stop sharing.
Great.
All right. And move us on to the next slide. So I'm going to pick up from Liz from here. So talk a little bit about our policies around serving folks that may not have legal immigration status. So this is a common source of confusion when we monitor. So HUD does not require people to have legal immigration status as a condition of receiving CoC assistance. And CT Boss actually has a policy for several years now that says that if your agency is not required by the federal government to verify immigration status, which government agencies sometimes are, but nonprofits are not, that you will not do anything. You won't ask for social security cards or social security numbers in order to determine whether or not somebody's eligible for the project. So if you are a nonprofit, you should not be verifying immigration status for your CoC project. So, and the more details are here on this slide, including the, if anyone at your agency has questions about that and you need an official HUD resource that goes beyond Liz and I to point them to, there's a link here on the HUD's, on the slide with an official message from HUD about this policy. So we will also look when we come to monitor to make sure every agency is required to have written non-discrimination policies that cover both your practices as an employer, right, as well as your practices in terms of not discriminating against the people that you serve or the applicants that are applying for services. So those policies should include the usual things, right, that are in a non-discrimination policy, right? You're not going to discriminate on the basis of race, ethnicity, what do they call that? National origin, gender. And then we also want to make sure, as Liz just discussed, when we were talking about our local LGBTQIA+ policies, you want to make sure that your non-discrimination policy also says that you don't discriminate on the basis of sexual orientation, gender identity, or gender expression. And then you also want to make sure that it says that you comply with fair housing, that you comply with federal equal opportunity requirements, federal reasonable accommodation requirements, and that you don't discriminate against people on the basis of religion. So those are sort of all the things that we'll look to make sure your policy includes when we come out and monitor. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on this. As Liz said a moment ago, Abby Miller on our team did do a really thorough training on equal access. There are links to that training on this slide. I'll just say that HUD really has this, what I think is a very beautiful definition of family, which is basically that a family, are the people that you identify as part of your family, right? So we don't in these federal programs have any rules that to say that people have to be married or that they have to be blood related. Basically, any group of people that present for services and say that they're a family, just by definition of them identifying themselves as a family, we should serve together as a family. And we cannot, this is another aspect of the federal equal access requirement. We've got to make sure, back in the day, many of you have been around for long enough to remember the day when we had programs that were specifically for men or programs that were specifically for women, right? The federal government, HUD has made very clear that that is not allowable except in very limited circumstances. So the only time that you can have a program that is restricted to just, a certain gender is when that program has bathrooms that are intended for use by more than one person at a time, or a sleeping room, bedrooms, right, or dorm style sleeping that are intended for use by more than one person at a time. If your program does not meet those criteria, you cannot limit your services based on gender. So, and we want to make sure that we are also accommodating changes that occur as people's household composition changes, right? So just because I'm a single today doesn't mean tomorrow I'm not going to have a girlfriend that I want to have housing with. And so even if you admit people into your program as singles, if they later have children or partner up or, you know, have somebody, a grandmother, an aunt, a cousin, a friend that they want to move in with them and that they consider part of their family, we need to be accommodating those changes. We know that those relationships are super important for people, help people to, in the long run, maintain housing stability and be happy as human beings. And so there are very limited circumstances in which we are going to say no to those things. And that's primarily because the unit isn't large enough, right, by HUD standards. So HUD requires that there be one, not necessarily bedroom, but it could be a living room for each 2 people in the household. One place where people can sleep for at least every 2 people in the household. And so that would be a reason, right, that you're a congregate project, you've got a studio unit, right? You're not going to move a family of 4 into a studio unit. Or if you've got, let's say you're a scattered site program and you've got, you know, a unit available that's budgeted as a 1 bedroom or a 2 bedroom, and you're pretty much fully spent on your grant and you don't have enough money in your grant to rent a 3 bedroom unit, then that might be a reason why you would say no, no, you know, based on family size or accommodating a larger family. Whenever that happens, if you have to say no to someone for an allowable reason, then you would want to make sure that you're linking back to the CAN and trying to transfer them to a different project that can accommodate their full family. So we also are required, of course, in the CoC program to honor federal fair housing requirements. So again, you know, not to discriminate on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, disability, whether or not someone has kids, you know, where they come from, their nation of origin. And then Connecticut state law also prohibits discrimination in housing on the basis of sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression. So, and the Department of Justice, the Federal Department of Justice has made it clear that it is a fair housing violation when a certain practice has a discriminatory effect, even if your intent was not to discriminate. And the place where this comes up is because in our country, racism is unfortunately still alive and well. We definitely see that folks who are, you know, folks of color, right, are much more likely because of systemic racism to be involved in the criminal justice system. So if you have a policy that says we don't accept people who, you know, have a certain felony conviction or a certain, you know, any conviction within a certain amount of time, right? In effect, that's going to mean that people of color have less access to that housing, right? Because people of color are more likely to be criminal justice system involved. And that is a fair housing violation. And we'll talk a little bit more in a minute about ways that you can avoid that happening. So, and then HUD also has the requirements, and we talk about this whenever we come out and monitor, that we want to make special efforts to make sure that people who come from marginalized groups, you know, folks who with disabilities, folks that come from racial minorities, ethnic minorities, that we do make special efforts to market so that they know that CoC housing is available out there in their communities. So HUD requires, they call it affirmatively furthering fair housing, that's special marketing, and then it requires that you maintain records of those marketing activities. So that might be things like, you know, your CAN did a presentation for the local disability rights organization, or your CAN did a presentation at a, you know, to clergy in the, you know, Black churches, right? Or, you know, you did special outreach in Spanish, right? You took out and maybe 211 did a billboard in Spanish in your neighborhood. HUD can ask when they come to see records that that marketing actually happened. You're also required under these affirmatively furthering fair housing requirements that if you encounter a violation of someone's fair housing rights, so for example, a landlord says, I don't rent to families with children, not allowed under fair housing, and you as a recipient or subrecipient of CoC funds are required to make a report to either the Department of Housing, or if you live in one of Connecticut's larger cities and you're an entitlement jurisdiction and you have your own con plan, to report that to the entity that's responsible for that con plan. And we are always available to help you figure out who that is. And then lastly, we want to make sure that participants, right, the people that we serve, are aware of their fair housing rights and what to do if somebody violates their fair housing rights. And so HUD could ask you to show evidence that you have provided folks in your program with this information. And so what we've done is we've incorporated that into the CT BOSS Participant Bill of Rights. So as long as you're having people sign off on the fact that they have received the CT BOSS Participant Bill of Rights, you can provide that as evidence when HUD comes to monitor that you've met that requirement.
Great. Lauren, we have a question.
Oh, yeah.
Does this apply to Section 8 funded programs? We are seeing this with folks who have received moving on vouchers. It takes months of grievances to get a voucher approved when there is a criminal background.
Yeah, so it applies to, it absolutely does apply to, and I just went back so that you could see, there's a link on this. It looks like the link's not live, but you can cut and paste it on this slide to the Department of Justice document that lays this out. So this is a resource if you've got even private market landlords, right? Should not, like, it's, they're also required to follow fair housing. So if you're having difficulty, you can provide folks, you know, with this memo from the DOJ that really explains this stuff. All right, so a couple of things we want to make sure we do and that we're encouraging all of our Section 8 landlords, other landlords to do. So one is we want to make sure that we retain all of our application records and that we, if we have to deny somebody, we document the reason that they were denied. And there are very few reasons that we're denying people in CoC housing, right? It's generally because they're not eligible, right? Because the CAN referred someone that didn't have adequate eligibility documentation and we couldn't serve them because they weren't eligible, or because they didn't show up, or because they decided that this program wasn't a good fit for them and they don't want to live there. So those are generally the allowable reasons to deny someone, and you want to document that that was the reason for the denial. Like I said, you really want to make sure, ideally, that your CAN is documenting that affirmatively furthering fair housing, right? That they're doing that special marketing to make sure that marginalized communities know about these resources. I know that that's hard for the CANs to do, and every CAN might not be there yet. So whatever you can do to help the CANs get there is great, because the responsibility of HUD comes out and monitors is going to be on the project to show that documentation. So, and then you want to make sure that you don't have any blanket policies against renting people with criminal records. So you don't want to say we don't rent to people with felonies, or we don't rent to people with certain kinds of felonies. You are able to, on a case-by-case basis, consider that information, right? So let's say you've got somebody that has a very serious arson history, and you know that you've got good reason based upon that history to feel like you could not safely maintain that person in the housing, that person would need a whole bunch of wraparound services in order to be safe, in order to be safe for them and everyone else, that you are not able to provide. That would be an individualized assessment that you could make, and you just want to make sure that you're documenting that individual assessment that you made. You never want to consider arrests, right? Not legal to consider arrests. You may only consider convictions in doing that individualized assessment. And you just want to make sure that if you have to deny somebody, you know, based on any kind of criminal justice background, that there is no other alternative. It was the only way that you could ensure that, you know, the safety and security of the residents and the property. So I am not an expert on fair housing. The folks at the Connecticut Fair Housing Center are experts on this stuff. So really encourage you. They're great. If you've got detailed questions about this, they're a good resource. They've got all these trainings, fact sheets, etc. So tap them, please. We also need to make sure in our CoC programs that we're following the federal reasonable accommodation requirements, right? So a reasonable accommodation is basically a request by somebody with a disability to do something different than what we normally do for everyone else, right? So an example might be somebody has serious and persistent mental illness. They're on, psychotropic medications. Those medications make them more susceptible to heat-related illnesses, and so they need more air conditioning than someone might normally need, and so they can request a higher utility allowance in order to enable them to successfully participate in your program despite their disability. So there are a number of other examples here on this slide. I won't go through all of them. When we're talking about getting documentation about why the reasonable accommodation request is needed, it's the same rules that we follow for disability documentation for the PSH projects, the permanent supportive housing projects. So that documentation need not come from a doctor. It can come from any professional who's licensed to diagnose and treat the disability. So if you've got somebody that's making a reasonable accommodation request on the basis of their mental health disability, then you can have a social worker, for example, a licensed social worker can provide the documentation that, to say, yes, I agree that this is necessary based upon the person's disability. And you really want, whenever you can, to try to accommodate reasonable accommodation requests. It's important to know that people don't not need to make these requests in writing. You should not be requiring people to make these requests in writing. And they don't need to say, this is a reasonable accommodation request, right? Your staff should be able to recognize when somebody's making a reasonable accommodation request, even if they don't use the words reasonable accommodation request. And then the only reason why you should really deny these requests is when something is, in HUD speak, an undue burden, an undue hardship, right? And so that might be, for example, if somebody's asking for a larger unit, right, because they've got a bunch of medical equipment and they need a larger unit to store their medical equipment, and you're fully tapped in your budget, right? You just don't have money in your budget to be able to rent them a larger unit. That would be a reason why you could deny the request.
Lauren, we have a hand up. I think Peggy has a question.
Sorry about that. It really has to do with our shelter. So I had a question about, as far as if somebody has a recent arrest for strangulation and child abuse and stuff like that, is that a reasonable reason that we don't allow them in our family shelter, like into our shelter?
I would need to know a lot more information about the particulars. So I'm going to actually say, let's talk offline and,
Okay.
And then, yeah. Okay. So my email is at the end of the presentation. So just
Okay.
email me or call me and we'll talk offline.
All right.
So federal, these are some other requirements that we've got to follow in our programs related to accessibility for people with disabilities. Obviously, I think we're all very familiar with the ADA requirements that say that our facilities have to be physically accessible to people. We also need to make sure that we are communicating effectively with people with disabilities. So that means, maybe having sign language interpreters if we've got somebody that's hearing impaired. It means large print for people that are visually impaired. And it can mean sometimes having what's known as an auxiliary aid, right? So for example, if you've got somebody that's got a cognitive disability and has trouble processing information, if you're having a group meeting, you might assign somebody to sit next to them to help them to really follow what's going on in the meeting. And that, again, to the maximum extent possible, unless it's would cost money that you guys just simply do not have in your budget, or there's other sort of undue hardship reasons why you can't accommodate these things, we really do need to be making accommodations to make our projects accessible in all ways, not just in terms of physical plant, to folks with disabilities. And that includes some reasonably complex requirements, unfortunately, around me. I feel like I'm always the bearer of bad news when it comes to the federal government and how complicated everything is. But we are required to make sure that our websites, if your program receives CoC funds, either as a recipient or as a subrecipient, your website needs to meet Section 508 requirements for people with visual disabilities. And all the documents that you post to your website, or any electronic documents that you're sharing in other ways, right? Through email is probably the most common one. All of those documents need to meet federal accessibility requirements. So there's a whole training that we did on this. It's linked to the slide. I think ideally the best ways for agencies to, this is what we've done at CT Boss, is we've got somebody that we use that is, expert in this stuff and specifically reviews our stuff and makes sure that it's all accessible. So that I think is a good strategy. If you can pay a consultant, an outside consultant, to do some of this stuff. I know agencies may not be able to afford to pay an outside consultant. You can maybe get a person on your team, one person who's going to really learn how to do this, and then, be the point person for doing this. So ideally, it's not going to be every single case management outreach worker, et cetera, that's responsible for doing all of this. So an easy place to start, if you haven't already started on this, Shannon on our team pulled together under the tools, it's the last line here on this slide, simple steps to create accessible materials. If you do nothing else on this, please look at that document and try to follow the guidance that's on that document. All right. We also need to make sure that our programs are accessible to people who may not speak great English, speak or understand English very well. And so what that means is that we need to assess, right? How often do we encounter people that have limited English proficiency? What language needs exist in our community? Is it Urdu? Is it Vietnamese? Is it Spanish? What resources do we have available? Translation resources, can we use the telephone-based translation services? Do we have staff that are bilingual in these languages that we can rely on to translate? And then that you've got a plan, so you do an assessment about what the needs are, and then you have a plan for how you're gonna, meet those needs. And so there's a sample policy here. So if you don't already have a plan, you might want to look at that policy and adapt it for your use. And then also linked here is the rule from the federal government. It's fairly complicated, so you may not want to dig deep into that. I would just look at the sample policy if I were you.
Lauren, we have a question.
Okay.
So how does the website requirement apply to multi-service agencies? I really am not able to comment on the other portions of your program, right? I know it applies to the CoC services. I do not know the extent to which all of these federal requirements apply to every other funding stream that your agency has. So sorry. All right, so I'm going to launch the poll here. All right. Everybody should be able to see the poll. Yes. So the first question is, can an agency have a client advisory committee instead of a person with lived experience of homelessness on their board? The second question is it a fair housing violation if a landlord refuses to rent to someone because of an arrest?
The third question is, are both recipient and subrecipient agencies required to ensure accessibility of electronic documents? Give people a couple minutes to answer those questions, and then we will go through the responses. All right, 10 more seconds and then I'll start. All right, I'm going to end the poll and share the results. So you guys should be able to see the results here. So on the first question is whether or not a client advisory committee is allowable in lieu of having a person with lived experience of homelessness actually on your board. Wow, only 30%, oh yeah, wait, sorry, 70% of people got that question correct. The correct answer to that is no, right? So a client advisory committee is not an acceptable substitute. What HUD has said is that the entity that they sit on has to have the ability to make policy without being overridden by the board. So if you want to set up some separate structure, you can, but that structure has to be able to make policy and the board can't overturn their decisions. So it's probably easier to just put someone on your board. So the second question, is it a fair housing violation if somebody refuses to rent to somebody because of an arrest? And 87% of you guys got the answer to that correct. The answer is yes. You cannot consider arrests in looking at this. You can only consider convictions. And then lastly, are both recipient and subrecipient agencies required to ensure accessibility of electronic documents? And 98% of you got the answer to that right. Regardless of whether or not you are getting money, CoC money as a recipient, or you are getting it as a subrecipient, you're contracted by the recipient, you've got to meet these federal requirements around accessibility of electronic documents. All right. So is that just a few more policies that we're going to go through here, and then I'm going to turn it back over to Liz. So we also want to make sure that all agencies, recipient and subrecipient agencies both, have a written grievance policy, and that you inform the folks that you're serving about their right to file a grievance and about how specifically, what's the process they would use to file such a grievance. Also for DEMIS PSH projects and DOH rapid rehousing projects, there's also a requirement that your agency designates a staff person that's assigned to help people navigate that process. So that's often referred to as the client rights officer in the DEMIS policies. And we think that that's a really good practice, and we encourage all agencies to do that regardless of whether or not you're a DEMIS PSH or DOH rapid rehousing program. And then CT Gloss also has a grievance policy. And so if a consumer has used your agencies, has a complaint, a grievance about a CoC program, and they have gone through your agency's grievance process and they still are not satisfied, they have a right to file a grievance with CT Boss, and our grievance committee will hear that policy. And the specifics of the grievance requirements for DEMIS PSH and DOH rapid rehousing programs are in those respective operations guides, which are linked on this slide. We also, of course, we know that, kids whose families are experiencing homeless, or young people who are experiencing homelessness on their own without their families, have not great educational outcomes, right? Not great school attendance. And that is part of what we need to address in order to break the intergenerational cycle of poverty and homelessness. And so super important that we are helping people to understand what their educational rights are, and that we are helping people to get access to school and access to the services in school that they need in order to be able to succeed educationally. And so we require in CT Boss that you provide information to people about their educational rights. And there's some posters that are linked here. You want to make sure that those are posted at your sites, and that you're also giving, I know a lot of you guys are doing a lot of scattered site services, right? You might not have clients coming into your sites often. So in that case, you want to make sure that you are physically providing this information to the folks that you're serving. And then we also have a requirement that you adopt more comprehensive educational rights policy. And we've got a sample policy that's linked in this slide. It covers a lot of stuff. We're not going to go through everything that it covers now, but the gist of the policy is basically 4 things, right? You're responsible for making sure that kids and young adults get enrolled in school if they're legally required to or want to. You are going to make sure that they can get to school, right? That they get the transportation services that they're entitled to, and that they are accessing all of the different educational services that they are entitled to under the McKinney-Vento law, or what's been updated as the Every Student Succeeds Act, or ESSA. And then 4th, you've got to designate somebody on your staff that knows what people's educational rights are, knows what they're entitled to, and is responsible for connecting kids to the educational services in your community. So when we come out and monitor, if you're serving children or young adults, we will always ask you, who is that designated staff person on your site? That is a federal requirement.
I'm on mute.
I think we need to mute someone, maybe, yeah. All right, so confidentiality, right? We know that the folks that we serve have experienced all sorts of indignities in their life. The last thing that they need is for their personal business to, be publicly available or, shared in any reason other than a real need to know. So we do check, this is a requirement, a CoC requirement, something we look at when we monitor to make sure that you've got written policies and procedures to ensure that we are honoring people's right to confidentiality. We do not make an assessment about whether or not your agencies are required to follow federal HIPAA requirements, which are much more extensive. That is beyond the scope of what we do at the CoC. But each of your agencies should have done that assessment to determine whether or not, given the particulars of your operations, whether federal HIPAA requirements apply as well or not. You are also required at your agencies to have a drug-free workplace policy and to post, some sort of sign that says this is a drug-free workplace. I'm not going to go through all of the things that policy has to include. We do look at those policies in detail when we monitor to make sure your policy covers all of these things. The highlights are here on the slide, this one and the next one, of what needs to be included in that policy. Conflicts of interest. So basically, I think this can be confusing for folks, but basically a conflict of interest is any situation in which a person has competing commitments or duties, right? So the classic example of in the CoC program is your agency owns a building, right? Staff at your agency who are your employees that are reliant on you for their paycheck should not be, may not be under federal rules, responsible for doing housing quality inspections in units that you own or doing rent reasonableness determinations in units that you own, right? You don't want the agency that owns the building to say, yes, we are charging reasonable rent, or yes, we are doing a good enough job maintaining housing quality. That is a conflict of interest. So, and there are many other things that could be conflicts of interest. Those are just two examples. So you've got to make sure that you've got a written conflict of interest policy. You've got to make sure that that policy applies not only to your employees, but often to your boards. Usually agencies have two separate policies, one that applies to employees and another that applies to their board. And that policy also has to extend to consultants and contractors and other, other people that may be independent, not employees of the agency, but are still doing business with the agency. The place where we most often see issues with this is that HUD requires that the prohibition, that policy extends the prohibition against conflicts of interest for 1 year following someone's tenure with the organization, right? So an example would be if I'm a housing specialist, right? And I'm making all of these relationships with landlords that I'm renting to, I cannot be setting up myself for my private business adventure to open up a property management company, right? So I can't be a housing specialist today, tomorrow leave the agency and offer property management services to all the landlords that I was working with when I was working in the CoC program. So I have to take a 1 year hiatus between when I leave the agency and when I, start to do business with people that I was associated with through the agency, right? That's sort of the spirit of the 1 year extension requirement. You also need, am I passing this on to you, Liz,
Yep.
now? Am I still going? Yeah.
Yep.
Okay.
Nope, I'm jumping in. So more written standards. So we need to make sure that all subrecipients and recipients are going to follow the written standards that we talked about an hour ago now in the local requirements slide. So take a look at those. And then your agency has to have written standards. You have to have policies around these. For DEMIS CoC projects, those are under the CoC Rental Assistance Operations Guide. And for DOH Rapid Rehousing, those are covered by the Rapid Rehousing Operations Guide. I'm sorry, I can't see. So rent reasonableness. So this is not a new requirement, but it has not previously, we haven't monitored on this. So we are newly monitoring on this. And project agencies, recipients, subrecipients have to make sure that you have policies on comparable rents, rent reasonableness, and how you're documenting that rent reasonableness. And again, DEMIS CoC rental assistance projects would be covered by the Rental Assistance Operations Guide. DOH Rapid Rehousing projects are covered by the Rapid Rehousing Operations Guide. And then there's some resources here for you on rent reasonableness, fair market rent, and certifying rent reasonableness.
I'll just say if you're an agency that isn't covered by one of these guides, you might just want to lift some of this from these guides. So feel free to plagiarize all you want. That might be a quick way for your agency to get this required policy in place.
Yes, Lauren reminds me that for the most part, we live in a lovely world where we try to share as much as we can. That's certainly housing innovations, anything we create, we share. So there are a lot of really good documents on the website, and what's out there, the state documents are public. So lift away, as Lauren said, because there's good stuff out there. All right, so we're going to talk about data related requirements. And our favorite system performance measures. And I am excited because I do think that more and more people are wrapping their heads around this, and much thanks to our friends at CCH who quarterly present at the steering committee meetings. And if you don't come to the steering committee meetings, I'll do a shameless plug, which is they're open to everybody. We love to have people. It's one of the few benefits of Zoom that folks can join a steering committee meeting from the comfort of your own home. And we have twice as many people come to steering committee meetings now. So come join us and hear good stuff there. So no more plugging. Anyway, system performance measures. So this is sort of like our report card, right? How is our CoC doing over 6 measures? And what goes into system performance measures are all the data from all the programs in our system, with some exceptions. Sometimes we're just looking at CoC funded projects. And so we're looking at how long are people homeless, and then HUD and the CoC, CT Boss, say, we hope not for very long, and that people are getting into housing quickly. So that's the goal, right? We're looking at how many people were homeless and then unfortunately went back to homelessness. And the aim of, again, HUD and the CoC is to make people stable in their housing and not have any returns. We're looking at how many people are experiencing homelessness. And clearly the goal is to not have this number be very high, for this number to go down and to get housing for everyone. Okay, we're gonna a measure looks at employment and income growth. And then the expectation is that providers are constantly working with participants to connect to job, to connect to benefits, so that folks are employed, people have jobs, and people have benefits and some money. Newly homeless folks, we hope that this doesn't happen, right? So the expectation of providers is that there's diversion services in place so that people don't ever have to become homeless. And then the last performance measure, exiting to permanent housing. So we want folks to either stay in permanent housing or to get to permanent housing. And the expectation then of providers is to help them do that, to either stay safely where they are in permanent housing or to find another permanent place to go. And CCH has a great data quality page with lots and lots of tools and resources, both for, we'll talk about the APRs in a minute, but both for how system performance measures are impacted, but also how to work on your APR and just improve data quality overall.
So I just wanted to say quickly, right, that how well each of you do on these measures, right, influences how much money we get in the CoC to develop, to continue to fund our existing renewals, as well as to develop new housing. So that is one reason, in addition to the fact, obviously, that as human beings, we don't want people to be homeless. It also really influences the resources that we have to help people end their homelessness.
Exactly, very much. So HMIS, for those who don't know, or I'm sure you will know if you don't know yet, the Homeless Management Information System. So this is the system that started back in 2004. And Lauren tells a funny story about before we had a place where we could actually know who's coming, who's going, count everyone, people would sit around a conference table and for the region say like, well, how many people do you think were homeless this year? Well, you have 10 and I have 12. Well, that's high, and come to some consensus, and sort of like, that's how it was figured out, how many homeless folks people had, because we didn't have the tools. And then I remember working at an agency in New York in like the early 2000s when people started to talk about HMIS. And it's so funny to think back now because people were so negative and against it. They were like, this will never happen. No one's ever gonna we'll never get the participants to give us the information. Who's gonna enter it? And remember, it's a long time ago, they were like, that agency only has one computer and only Bob uses the computer. And how are we gonna do this? And there was like anxiety and panic. And so it is fun to look back and see like where we started, from the conference table of like people counting to like the panic of we'll never be able to do this, to a pretty amazing system of a collection of data that lets us do a lot of things, right? So the CANs use it. We use it for service provisions. We just talked about SPMs, right? So that's how we get our SPMs. We use it for the PIT and the HIC, the point in time count and the housing inventory chart. We use it for renewal evaluation, which pulls the information also for APRs. So it's pretty amazing what can happen. We could spend 4 days waxing poetic about HMIS, but it's just to remember, like Lauren said, the importance of getting this in, because it informs so many systems. It informs our funding. It informs our ability to do so many things. So when you're having an existential crisis banging on the computer with numbers, just keep in mind that there really is just a larger purpose, and it's pretty amazing where we are now. And our friends at CCH, they're the lead on this, and Lindsay and Rose have been doing a really great job. Okay. Lauren put this one in to see if I could start twitching. So the housing inventory chart and is the annual inventory of shelter, transitional housing, all our different model types that we put together and count every year. And the point in time count is the annual count of people experiencing homelessness. This year it was January 25th. And I'm laughing and twitching because we just submitted to HUD through HUD system HDX this morning. So Alice Minervino sat and watched something spin or on her computer for an hour, but it went through. We're really excited that it's over. We'll take this time to thank people, because you guys have to do a lot of work to make this happen, and we're very mindful of that. And I appreciate that nobody has blocked my calls or my emails for the last minute questions. People have been really, really helpful. We really rely, as you know, on providers to make this happen. And then we rely on outreach workers. This year is different, just like last year was different because of COVID. So we don't rely on hundreds of volunteers going out anymore, but we rely on HMIS, on providers, on outreach workers. There was an unsheltered app used this year to capture unsheltered folks, people living in encampments, in cars, staying in places that are not places that someone should live. So that was the HIC and PIT this year. We really appreciate your help and everybody's efforts to make this happen. So Lauren just touched on this a little bit too, like, why does this matter? Why do we collect all of this? As Lauren was saying, SPMs help us get our funding from HUD. HUD it changes each year, but maybe a quarter to a third of our points in the CoC application come from SPMs. And so HUD wants to see us improving. So that's one reason it's very important. We also just want to keep improving our performance. Everybody who's here, we just want to do better, right? We want to serve more people. We want to get people stably housed. And so looking at these data, seeing what's happening, lets us do that. We want to see where there are needs and gaps in the system. For example, where are there unsheltered folks living? Do we need more targeted outreach in those areas? And then planning, looking at numbers and data helps us say, we have very scarce resources, as we know. Where are we going to put them? Where are we going to spend our time, effort, and resources? Okay. APRs, this is really everybody's favorite. So as you know, and if you don't know, you'll find out, you must do an APR for your project. They need to be done within 90 days of the end of the project. The hope is that they are as accurate as possible. If they are not, HUD can put a hold on your funding. So it's really important that these are done. There are instructions for running an APR, and I would encourage you to take a look at that. You're going to submit these via Sage, and there is also a HUD training on using Sage to complete your APR. And I was laughing. I'm like, wow, when anything gets its own slide, this is really important. So I was like, maybe Miles asked for this slide. Miles has probably called some of you about this topic. So this is really important. The number of participants served needs to be the same number that's in your project application. So your APR number needs to match your project application number. And something important to keep in mind is your project application, that is your promise to HUD. That's what you told HUD you're going to do. And it's a competitive process. So HUD awarded you that because you said you were going to do this. So it's important that what's in your project application in general matches up. But right now we're talking about the number of participants, and we want to make sure that what's in the application matches what's in the APR.
So it can always be higher, right? It just don't, it's, you know, it should not be lower, right? So that's a real red flag to HUD if you're not serving the number of people that you said you were gonna serve.
Yep. So I think we're gonna do a poll. I don't have the polls. Lauren, are you able to launch that? You are muted.
I launched it.
Oh, great. I'm sorry.
Can you see it? You need me to, you can't
Yeah,
see it,
do you
right?
mind? I don't
Yeah.
know why. I don't
Don't
know.
worry.
Setting issue, but I
Zoom
can't.
is not our friend today. I don't know why either. So the first question is, which of these is a conflict of interest? And then it gives you a number of selections. The second question is, which of these is a violation of client confidentiality? And it gives you a number of options. The third question is, how are HMIS data used? So I'll give people a couple minutes here and then we will go over the responses. All right, about 10 more seconds to get your answers in, and then we'll go over these responses. Trying to keep my dog out of my office and it's not working. She may join the Zoom in a moment.
I think she should. Mine's here. She's just being quiet. So.
Mine was being quiet and then she's welcome to stay, but then she wasn't being quiet. So
I
now I'm
lost it.
trying to get her out, but it's not, she's not cooperating.
Oh, see, Elaine Matt wants to see her.
Bring her in, put her on your lap.
But yeah, but then then we'll really have trouble with advancing the slides.
she's
So I'm
very
sure
cute,
in a
though.
minute when she comes back.
Yes.
All right, so I'm going to end the poll. So the first question, which of these is a conflict of interest? An employee conducts an HQS inspection on a unit owned by their agency. A project rents units from an employee's son. A supervisor has a close friendship with the supervisee. An agency uses an employee's catering business to provide meals at a program site, or all of the above. And 78% of you answered correctly, all of the above. Now, the third one, a supervisor has a close friendship with a supervisee. That's probably not the kind of conflict of interest that HUD is going to be concerned with, but it is a conflict of interest. The rest of those are going to be the kinds of conflicts of interest that could get you in trouble with HUD. The second question, which of these is a violation of client confidentiality? Sharing an interesting story about a client with a coworker, sharing information with a colleague about a client to coordinate services, having a list of clients posted on the bulletin board by your desk, or leaving a client file open on your desk while you step away. So each of these, except for the second one, sharing information with a colleague about a client to coordinate services, right? That is allowable. If it's within your agency, you don't necessarily need a release of information. If it's a colleague outside of your information, you should have a release of information. But that kind of information sharing is allowable. All of the other examples here would be violations of client confidentiality.
Even sharing with the first one, sharing with a coworker?
Sharing an interesting story about a client with a coworker. So, I mean, this may be just it's not necessarily clear here, but we shouldn't just be sharing, it shouldn't be gossipy, right? We're not at work to gossip about clients. So if the only reason you're sharing that story is to gossip about the client, that's a violation of client confidentiality.
Right.
If you're sharing
If
you're sharing information because the person needs to know because of some, legitimate service related reason, then it's not a violation of client confidentiality. So the last question, how are HMIS data used? To help participants get access to housing programs, to help coordinate services for participants, to generate the annual progress report, the APR, to evaluate, now she's eating something that she's not supposed to be eating, to evaluate project performance and determine if funding will be continued, to evaluate systems performance and determine how much money is available throughout the CoC for renewal and new projects, or all of the above. And 88% of you answered correctly that it's really all of the above, right? That's why HMIS is so important, because we really are using it to do all of these things. All right. Am I back? I think I'm back up now, right, Liz? So we're just going to go through remaining a couple more administrative requirements that we didn't already cover. So the first one is environmental review. We did a whole training on this in person, face-to-face, back when one could do such things back in 2018. And we've got a very extensive guide on this. It's linked here. It's the frequently asked questions guide. So I'm not going to go through, it's reasonably complicated environmental review. I'm not going to go through it all now. I just wanted to say a couple of quick things. So first of all, we did that big push to get all the environmental reviews done in 2018. Those environmental reviews are required at minimum to be updated every 5 years. So that means all of those environmental reviews that we did in 2018 are going to need to be redone next year in 2023. So even if you're a scattered site project, right, you're going to have to get your responsible entity to sign off again on your environmental review next year in 2013. I think people know that there's kind of two different levels of environmental review. Congregate projects require a higher level of environmental review, and scattered site projects require a lower level of environmental review. And so I think most of our congregate projects also did their environmental reviews in 2018, and you're going to have to, and I think DEMIS is, I know, trying to figure out now what the mechanism is going to be to help people get that done. So there's a flow chart that's linked on this document that helps you to understand what kinds of projects need which kind of environmental review. And like I said, the frequently asked questions document is here. So you need that environmental review at least every 5 years. And you also need it if your environmental conditions change, right, in your, at your project. And so an example of that would be, suddenly you find out that there's a brownfield located next to your congregate project, or an airport opens up on your block, right? It doesn't happen very often, but there are circumstances in which you would need to update your environmental review. And I should have started with this, but for people that don't know, environmental review really is a way of making sure, the intent of it is to make sure that we are, not exposing people in our programs to environmental hazards It's important. We know that low-income folks do face disproportionately face toxins in the environment that they live in, and we want to make sure that we are not contributing to environmental, racial, or other kinds of environmental injustice. So, all right, if you have questions about environmental review or anything else, we're always happy to answer them. So this is a requirement that I think projects often have some difficulty with because it's hard to find a willing partner at the other end at your departments of health. It was always hard. COVID did not make it any easier. We know that our local departments of health are very understaffed and overwhelmed. HUD does have a requirement if you are a tenant-based rental assistance program, which most of our scattered site housing and CT BOSS is, that you make an effort at least quarterly to coordinate with your local Department of Health to make sure that you are not leasing units that the Department of Health knows have lead-based paint hazards in those units. The Departments of Health keep track of where children or anybody who's, I think, tested positive for lead exposure live. And so, you know, we have some projects are very successful at setting up a nice collaboration and making that happen regularly. Many projects really struggle. So all you can do is really try your best to reach out to your Department of Health. You cannot control whether or not they are receptive to those efforts. So just document, you know, that you've reached out, make a note that you made the phone call, do it by email is probably the better way to do it if you can. And it's probably like, it's not something that we hear about HUD monitoring much. So, you know, obviously the more important thing is that we want to not expose people to lead poisoning. So make sure you're, of course, doing those visual inspections when you do your HQS. So record retention, the federal government requires that if your agency is receiving CoC funds, regardless of whether that's as a subrecipient or recipient, that you maintain all records pertaining to the program for a minimum of 5 years. Eligibility documentation, however, has to be maintained for longer. So you have to maintain eligibility documentation. So the fact that, you know, documentation of homelessness, if you're a PSH program, documentation of disability, if you're a YHDP program, documentation that the client met the age requirement, all that stuff needs to be maintained in the files for. The easy way to think about it, I feel like, is 7 years from when you exited the person from the project. And if you transfer people from one project to another, you need to make sure that that eligibility documentation files the participant. So please don't admit folks into your project as a transfer unless you also get their eligibility documentation. Once they're in your project, you are going to be responsible for demonstrating that you've got that eligibility documentation if HUD comes out and monitors. And I always say this is always the biggest finding in every single monitoring that we do. And at the end, we've got some resources that include some trainings just about eligibility documentation. We're not going to go into all of that today, but we've got resources up on the website to help you guys with that stuff. All right, so we also need to make sure HUD requires, we ask for this when we monitor, that your organizations have an organizational chart that shows, you know, where your CoC program is situated in your organizational structure, who the staff report up the chain of command. So you need to make sure that you've got such an organizational chart. And you also need to make sure that you've got job descriptions that define what your staff and your CoC program are responsible for doing. Obviously, it's a good idea for you to have these for all of your staff. We will only ask for them for your CoC funded staff when we come to monitor. So a little bit about if you are a nonprofit agency and you've got on your grant another nonprofit agency that is a subrecipient on the grant, that triggers certain requirements, and those requirements are pretty onerous, right? So if you are a recipient and you've got other nonprofits who are subrecipients, you are responsible for monitoring those subrecipients every year. And that is, you know, a lot for you guys to do. So we really encourage that if that's your structure, you know, we're always happy to talk to you about whether or not you could allowably, under the HUD rules, move from using a subrecipient to making that other organization a contractor. And if they are a contractor rather than a subrecipient, then you don't have to monitor them every year. So if that is your reality, let's have a conversation, and I'm happy to weigh in on whether or not the subcontractor option might be less onerous for you. If you stick with the subrecipient model, then you've got to monitor them every year. You've got to do some sort of report on that monitoring that you maintain in the files to show that you did it. You've got to provide that report to us as a CoC, which I could say in all the years that I've been doing this, I don't think we've ever gotten a single subrecipient monitoring report from any of your agencies. And you've got to make sure that if there were any deficiencies that were found during monitoring, that there's some sort of plan that the subrecipient has put in place to correct those deficiencies. Now, for, you know, HI does, Housing Innovations does monitoring for on behalf of DEMIS and on behalf of DOH. So, you know, what we do can count. Like if your agency gets monitored by us in any given year, you could use that as the evidence of this. But we do not monitor every project every year. You are also required, if you're using subrecipients, to have a written agreement, usually in the form of a contract, in place with that subrecipient. That contract has to include certain things. I'm not going to go through what all of them are, but those contract requirements with your subrecipients are outlined on this slide. So you want to make sure that your contract has each of these things in it. You are also required as an agency to have written intake procedures. So we've developed a sample written intake policy that you guys can just adopt. The policy has to follow the HUD requirements for documenting homelessness. So probably the easiest way to get it done is to just adopt the policy that we've provided for you in the sample that's linked here. If you are a DEMIS PSH project or a DOH rapid rehousing project, we've covered this for you in the operations guide, so you don't need to do this because it's already covered in the operations guide. All right, I'm sorry. I'm like tired of listening to myself talk. I can't imagine how tired you guys are listening to me talk, but we're nearing the end here. So HUD grant amendments. So basically, when you do your project application every year, I think Liz said this before, that is your contract, you know, that tells HUD what you're going to do with that money. And when HUD issues your grant agreement, you are bound by the things that you put in that project application. So there's certain kinds of changes that you're allowed to make without doing a grant agreement amendment. But there are many changes that you are not allowed to make without doing a grant agreement amendment. And so those things that require an amendment are on this slide. So the most common ones we see, occasionally we see somebody had a flyer, a FUD, you know, something happened, they lost their lease, and they have to move a program from one physical location to another physical location. That requires a grant agreement amendment. The reduction in the number of units, they're probably never going to approve it. So you can try, but they generally don't approve those. The most common one we see is budget changes. So if you have, for example, you don't have a supportive services budget line item in your grant, and you want to add a supportive services budget line item, or you don't have a project admin budget line item in your grant, and you want to add a project budget line item, that requires a grant amendment. They're not going to give you any more money. You're just going to have to shuffle the decks, the chairs on the deck. You move money from one line to another line. And certain kinds of moves of money from one line to another line, if it's more than 10% that you're moving out of a line into another line, that also requires a grant agreement amendment. So, there are processes that you have to follow in order to get such an amendment from HUD. Before you do that, the BOSS policy is that you get agreement from your CAN that what you're proposing to change makes sense for the CAN and the CAN agrees to it. And then you've got to prepare a written request to HUD to ask for this change to be made. And you've got to explain what's the reason that you need to make this change. And then the super important thing is that you've got to justify that you're going to continue to provide the same level of service. So that means like you're going to continue to provide either the same kinds of services, amount of services, types of services, or a better level of service. And you've got to continue to serve the same number of participants. So you can't say like rents went up, therefore we have to serve fewer people. That's not allowed in the CoC program. So you've got to always say that you're going to continue to serve the same number of people. And you cannot make the change until HUD has given you the amended grant agreement and you've signed off on it and it's all executed. The HUD field office staff will walk you through if they're going to approve the change, what are the other things that they might need you to do, like file an amended technical submission in ESAPs. There may be other technical things that they want you to do, but they'll advise you on that at the point that they say, yes, we're going to approve this, and here's what you need to do to get it to, get it into the end zone. All right. So Zengen, so this, people are hopefully familiar with this. There are some requirements that the CoC has around Zengen. So Zengen is the web-based database that CT Boss uses to keep track of all of our grants. And it is also the place where you guys give us contact information for the people who are responsible for your grants at your agency. And that's really super important, right? Because if we don't have current contact information, that means you're not going to get all the emails and you're going to miss things, right? Like, so that's particularly important whenever we've, like during Hick and Pitt, during renewal evaluation, during the competition, there's going to be important information that you need about your program that you're not going to get if you don't keep this information up to date. And so this year, for the first time in our renewal evaluation, we had a penalty associated with this, although I think we ended up waiving the penalties ultimately, but next year we probably won't waive them next year. So you want to make sure that you get into Zengen and you update those contacts at least quarterly, and that you provide at least two contacts. And if you have no idea what I'm talking about, you don't know what Zengen is, there's a link here on this slide that gives you more information about how to use Zengen and how to do this stuff. All right, so renewal applications, there's also a requirement that in Zengen that you have at least 2 staff people who have eSNAPS access, right? So eSNAPS, for people that don't know, is the system that HUD uses where you have to file your project application every year in the CoC competition to make sure that you continue to get funded. So very important. And we've seen too many times, right? Somebody goes on vacation and suddenly no one at the agency has eSNAPS access. So it's a CT Boss requirement that at least 2 people in your agency have eSNAPS access, and that you tell us who those 2 people are in your Zengen profile.
Please do. Lauren,
yeah.
There's just a question here back on the Zengen. When you say quarterly, is it at least once within a quarter, or are there other dates for it?
You want to go in, we suggest you go in once a quarter and you update it. Shannon sends out reminders about quarterly to do it. There aren't particular dates. When we look at it for renewal evaluation, we'll look at in the last quarter. Like, did you do it in the last? We're not going to look to say every single quarter, did you do it? We'll just look to see, did you do it in the last quarter?
Right. And if you go in and it's fine, great. If nothing's changed, there's a button that says keep the, I don't remember, I can't remember what, but just says, yep, this is it. But you still want to go in and say, yep, this is it. But I just know from talking to Miles, there have been some issues during renewal evaluation time where the break people aren't in there, there's confusion. So it's just really important to stay up to date on ZenGen and eSnaps.
So gosh, is that bothering you guys? Can you hear her barking?
No, I like
Okay.
it. I like it.
So the question everybody wants to know, right? When is the NOFO happening? We never know the answer to that question. The best we can do is tell you, the latest that HUD has told us. And at this point, what they have said is that they anticipate getting back on their intended NOFO cycle, which is that they would release the NOFO sometime in the late spring. Now, we are doubtful that that is actually going to happen, given the fact that they have not released anything about the grant inventory worksheet, the GIW yet. So I think the earliest we would anticipate a NOFO this year is the late spring. And then, once the NOFO drops, we will send you guys all sorts of information, resources, trainings, and the deadlines for what you need to do by when, to make sure that all of your project applications are in and reviewed and revised well in advance of when we actually have to submit the final application to HUD. All right, so I want to give people a chance to ask us any final questions. Like Liz said, we always are happy to hear suggestions about what you need from us to enable you, to support you to be in compliance with all of these really complicated rules, right? What we talked about today doesn't even get into a lot of things. We really just focused on the policies and the administrative requirements today. Can you put the slides in the chat, or is that still not working? I did think I put the slides in the chat earlier, but if it didn't work, Liz, can you get them up there again, maybe?
Put them up again, yep.
Thank you. And then before we go, we did want to, it's always helpful for us to hear from you guys what your priorities are in terms of compliance type trainings. And so we're going to do one final Zoom poll to get you guys to tell us, which compliance trainings we should focus on doing next year. So let me go ahead and launch that. All right, so launch. So the question is, which of these compliance related training topics are most important for your agency? You can choose, you can choose more, it won't stop you from choosing more, but if you choose them all, then it's not prioritized. So please try to choose just 3, and that'll help inform what we're gonna do next. And just so supportive service requirements, so that would be things like service planning and case notes and all the VAWA related requirements, rental assistance and leasing requirements. That would be things like leases and housing quality inspections and rent reasonableness. Eligible expenses is basically what can you spend money on and under which budget line items can you spend it on, what is not an eligible CoC expense, meaning if you spent money on that, HUD's going to come and take the money back. And then other kinds of financial management requirements, so like what policies and procedures are required, things like how do you what are the requirements around how you track staff time. And then finally, the match requirements and how you document your compliance with those requirements. And if you've got another suggestion that's not here and you selected other, please either unmute yourself and speak up and tell us what that other thing is, or put it in the chat. So probably what we're going to do is doing a full day. It's bad enough for you guys to have to sit through this for 2 hours. We don't want to ask you to have to sit through this for a full day. So probably what we'll do moving forward in the Zoom universe is do these trainings sort of in 2-hour chunks on Zoom, It also allows us to record them so that then when you have new people come on, it's hopefully an onboarding resource for those new folks. Give people another minute to get their responses in. And then after we're done here, we're just going to go through some other training resources where you can find them on the BOSS website, and then we're done. While we're giving people another minute to do the poll, I'm going to respond to Amanda's question in the chat, which is that she's working on annuals right now, and the report that comes out stating when they're due, as well as the date ranges, are on Zengen. I think you're talking probably about the APR, the annual progress report, Amanda. So that information is visible to us in Zengen, but not necessarily to you in Zengen. So, the way that that information is in your grant agreement with HUD. So your operating dates are defined in your grant agreement with HUD, the start and end date. And then the APR is due 90 days from the end date. And it's important to remember that HUD is very literal. So 90 days actually means 90 days. It does not mean 3 months. And then there's the other place that you can see that, in case you can't easily put your hands on your grant agreement amendment, is in Sage. I think you can see that information in the HUD Sage system. So, and if you have trouble finding it, you can reach out to Miles on our team. He has access to Sage. If you have trouble finding it, he can help. All right, I'm going to end the poll and share the results. So it looks like our top 3 priorities here are rental assistance and leasing requirements, which seems to be the most popular. Supportive service requirements are the second most popular, and then in third place is participant eligibility documentation requirements. And so we will work on getting that webinars on that content up for you in the next fiscal year, which starts July 1. But probably not until after the NOFO is due. So, all right, stop sharing. And then I'm just going to run really quickly through places where you guys can find some additional resources. So there are, back when we were still doing face-to-face training, we did do a multiple day series that was kind of soup to nuts on compliance issues. So the links to those are here. It's the HUD CoC policies and the managing CoC grants training. So the slides are available. Every year we do an introduction to the CT BOSS continuum of care. So if you've got folks that are new to your team, that might be something to include in your onboarding plan. It's recorded. We did a whole training just on dedicated plus eligibility for PSH projects. So that is the category of homelessness that replaced chronic homelessness that now all of our PSH projects require. So that training is recorded and up on the website. We did a whole training just on the DOH rapid rehousing operations guide and those requirements, that training, as well as the links to the guide and the links to where all the forms for that program is here. We did the same thing for the DMIS CoC rental assistance operations guide. So the training and links to that guide are here. These are resources for our YHDP program. We also did a series of trainings when the YHDP programs first started. The slides that was before Zoom, so those slides are available at these links. Howard and I did a whole, I think it was a 2-day or a day-and-a-half series on specifically for the fiscal requirements. And so for your fiscal staff, those resources are available here. Howard also did a recorded training more recently, just on the project admin and indirect funds in the CoC program. So that is recorded and here. And then finally, this is mine and Liz's contact information. So thank you. I'm sorry that
There is
so much
a
to
lot.
tell you. I wish that there weren't so many requirements for this program, but I hope it's helpful, and we're always available to answer questions. We'll stay on for a couple minutes in case people have questions that they didn't get answered, and I gift you back 2 minutes of your life.
We signed up for this. I like that. Good attitude. Good attitude.
Guys, I have a quick one.
Of
Yeah.
course.
Environmental reviews. So we did them in 2018, and except for any new properties that have come online, they're going to be due next year.
Yeah, exactly. So for scattered site, you guys have, I'm
All,
sorry, I don't
all
remember if you have-
scattered.
You're all scattered site, right? So what you're gonna have to do is have the whole form, like, because it needs to be signed again by the responsible entity.
Right.
So you're gonna need to update the form, right? And then if you're in a, because you guys are also in a coastal area, so you have to do the maps, right?
Yes, we did the maps for all of them. We did the
Yeah.
forms for each one.
Yeah, so you'll have to do the maps again for any units that are still in the program that you haven't done since 2018.
Right.
And then you'll have to, the ones that are, the maps are still good, you can just keep those.
Okay. So my question is, we had such a terrible time getting anybody local who would be willing, any town people, city people who were willing to put their name on anything.
So I know
We
last
had
time,
Department of Housing signatures. Is that still good to go as long as
that's a
we
good
do the
question.
work?
I will double check that our partners at the Department of Housing are still willing to do that for anyone that is unable to find somebody local to sign. But we will put that on our to-do list, Elaine.
I
I
think
believe
out
the
of
answer is
all-
yes, but I don't want to make commitments on the part of the
Right.
Connecticut.
Out of
Department.
all of the localities that we serve, I think we had 2 who were, we were able to find 2 people who were willing to sign, and we literally were getting flat out no's.
Yeah,
Won't do it.
yeah.
Won't put our name on it.
Yeah, it was a real mixed bag. You guys have very cooperative departments of health, though. You get lots of
Yes, we do.
cooperation. on
Yes,
them.
we do. We're
You can't
good
have it
there.
all,
You
Elaine.
can't have it all, babe. You can't have it all.
So
I-
Elaine,
I
I
just-
was experiencing those same problems with the environmental reviews. I did go to DOH and ask Miguel Rivera, who is the director of community, I don't remember his full title, but anyways, he did sign off on them for me.
That was
Um,
recent, Eric?
That was recent, yes.
Okay, good.
So I'm glad, I was actually just to go back, about to exit, and I heard Elaine's question about the environmental review, so I'm glad I stuck on for a second. So I've been doing them as, I did the full ones back in 2018.